The second thing Jesus does here is he gives them the power to forgive sins through the gift of the Holy Spirit. And he does this by something very strange. He breathes on each one of them, right? He says that he breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit, right? As the Father has sent me, so I send you. If you forgive the sins of any, they're forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they're retained. Now, on a very human level, having Jesus come up to you and breathe on you is going to be something you don't forget. That's not an ordinary human action. And you can see this would be a very powerful and solemn act. From a Jewish point of view, it would also be something more, because if you go back to the Old Testament, God breathes into the dust of the earth in order to give Adam the spirit of life, in order to make a man out of the clay of the ground. So it's a life-giving act. It's an act of creation. When Jesus breathes on the members of the 12 who are present, he is, in a sense, inaugurating a new creation through the power of the Holy Spirit. And one of the first acts of this new creation that he wants them to carry out is the power that we see manifested in the sacrament of reconciliation, which we commonly call the Sacrament of Confession, by which those who are the successors of the apostles have the power not just to forgive sins of those who may have harmed them, but to forgive all sins, sins against them, sins against the neighbor, sins against God, and here's the kicker, the power to retain those sins if the person confessing those sins is not actually penitent. So I think this is a really important and powerful episode, because it shows that in a real sense, Jesus is literally dying to institute the Sacrament of Confession, to institute the Sacrament of Reconciliation. One of the first things he wants to do after his resurrection is give the power to forgive sins to the apostles so that they can go out and begin that ministry of reconciliation that Paul talks about in his letters. A third element here that I want to highlight is just the whole question of Thomas's encounter with Jesus. And I've probably said this before, but I think it's worth saying again. We always talk about Thomas as doubting Thomas. And although there's truth to that, because Thomas here basically demands proof. He wants some kind of empirical proof before he will believe that Jesus is actually raised from the dead. Now, okay, on the one hand, he should believe that Jesus is going to be raised from the dead, because Jesus has actually told them he would be raised from the dead, and he also performed miracles that verified his divine identity and his sonship and all that. On the other hand, there is a certain reasonableness in demanding some kind of evidence for belief. The church does this all the time with the miracles of the saints, right? So the church will kind of withhold judgment until some verification has taken place with regard to the miracles that will be used to forward the cause of someone for canonization. And that's because the church believes in the use of reason, right? We believe, but we also use reason. We don't believe in faith alone in the sense of faith without reason. Faith and reason go together, although faith transcends reason. And so that's a kind of natural human instinct to want there to be evidence, especially if there's an extraordinary claim being made. In this case, the resurrection of Jesus is an extraordinary claim. Okay, so with that said, though, I don't think we should really refer to this just as doubting Thomas. We should call it doubting and believing Thomas, because what happens here is that when Jesus appears to him, he goes from faithlessness, from doubt, to not just faith, but to one of the greatest confessions of faith anywhere in the Gospels. So if you look here, when Jesus appears, go back there, he says to Thomas, put your finger here, see my hands, put out your hand, place it in my side. Do not be faithless. So that is a real charge there. I mean, he is lacking faith. Jesus says, do not be faithless, but believing. And in response to that exhortation, Thomas goes above and beyond. He doesn't just say, I believe. He says to Jesus, my Lord and my God. And that's the first time in the Gospel of John where someone confesses Jesus, not just as Messiah, not even just as Lord, but as God. And the Greek word there is theos, right, from which we get the word theology, the study of God. So a lot is often made of Peter's confession of faith, for example, in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 16, because Peter recognizes the divinity of Jesus when he says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus says, "Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven," right? We laud Peter for that confession of faith, and we should. I would also say, though, that sometimes we tend to forget that Thomas makes an equally amazing confession of faith here when he says that Jesus is his God, because it's a confession of the divinity of Christ. Now, obviously, Jesus doesn't respond to it in the exact same way, but I do think it's important because Jesus takes that confession of faith, which really is kind of the climax of John's gospel. Think about it for a second. This whole gospel has been building up to the revelation of the fullness of Jesus' divinity, right? It begins by saying, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God," theos. And now it comes to a climax with St. Thomas saying, "My Lord and my God," theos, the same word. So it's like bookends to the gospel, this climactic confession of faith. And then what Jesus does, though, is he calls all of us to go beyond Thomas, right? And for us to believe even when we can't see the concrete evidence of his resurrection, as Thomas did, because he pronounces a blessing, a beatitude, you might even say. He says, "Have you believed because you've seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe." Now, what does that mean? Again, Jesus here is pronouncing a special blessing on those of us who didn't live at the time of Christ, who didn't live in the 1st century AD, who didn't walk with him and talk with him and see him preach and teach and perform miracles and raise the dead. All of those things that would have been reasonable motives of credibility for believing him, we lacked those. We didn't experience them firsthand like Thomas did. And so Christ pronounced a special blessing on us. He says, "Blessed are those who didn't see," meaning haven't seen me in person, "and yet still believe." Because that really is a fruit of God's grace, that we're able to believe in him even though we didn't see firsthand the miracles that he accomplished. Now, we have testimony to them. We have the Gospels themselves. At the same time, there is something special about having been one of the 12, right? And witnessing Christ and being able to believe in his presence. So I take a lot of comfort in that notion that those of us who believe without seeing him have a special blessing pronounced upon us.